Welcome, everybody, to this week's podcast. We'll be taking a deeper dive into design thinking. I'm Chris Owens, and with me here today is Elizabeth Phillips. Welcome back to the podcast, Elizabeth.
Hi, thank you. I'm happy to be back.
Great. So I think this week we're going to start off with this week's TED Talk by Tim Brown on design thinking. So what was your overall take on his talk?
Well, I thought his talk was very interesting, even though he wasn't necessarily talking about education, so to speak. I recognized a lot of the design thinking that we read about last week and the toolkit that we read in a lot of his examples that he was using.
I agree with you. I also thought it was really interesting that he went further into the particulars about how the human aspect is really important, and that participants involved in the design thinking approach should be the people who are actually affected by whatever the problem is. So the example of the clean water and getting clean water in India, that really struck me. It would seem so logical that the people involved in the design process were not only the people who needed the water, but the people who were delivering the water. And that these poor communities that are recipients totally needed a new method or an improved method, because they were losing a lot of water along the way. So I like that he didn't just improve the process or the delivery method, but he also improved the containers that they had the water in and how they were moving the water. They were probably just carrying it before, and now they had carts that they were using. So it struck me because the solution involved all the aspects of the delivery process, but it wasn't high tech.
Right, and I think a lot of his examples sort of went along those lines. You know, such an exciting concept. It used to be that designers were just talking about the end phase, making a product pretty. But in this whole content, we're realizing how design thinking is a whole new level of thinking about design. And it's, from the inception all the way up to the end product, but it's usually, based on solving a problem. So it's really exciting to see his examples and see them come to life.
And I'm going to bring up a point that I had read about. So IBM is really implementing this whole design thinking, and they teach other companies how to do this design thinking. And they found that the, return on investment is so great. They're saving money. They're bringing products to market quicker. They're involving the human component to see what is it that the people want. And by doing this, the revenues have soared and the defects in the product have gone down by half.
Wow.
So it's pretty amazing how this design thinking can impact, people on a small scale and people on a large scale, and how businesses, if they adopt this, are, winning, because their customers are happy,
right,
their people inside are happy, and they're bringing products to market. So getting back to the video, Tim used the term integrative thinking. Could you expound on this idea a little bit?
Sure, because it wasn't a term I was familiar with when I first watched the video. So I obviously had to think deeper about that. And his way of explaining it was that integrative thinking is allowing for the opposing ideas because they're necessary and viable for creating the new ideas and solutions. So, for example, instead of searching for one perfect solution, they're exploring a lot of ideas in search of new ones. So allowing yourself to be open for failure in order to learn from and then also speed up the process. I think he talked about, putting prototypes on the market quickly, knowing that they're probably not the perfect product, but they're going to fail, but that allows them to learn from their failure and sort of speed up the process in search of getting to the perfect product or close to perfect product. So it's
right,
just, allowing people to come up with multiple different ideas and having, being open to not just focusing on one perfect solution, but allowing failure to happen.
Yeah, I like the term. Because when I think about integrating, it means, melding things together. And so you're getting all these multiple parties that are coming together to come up with a better solution. It kind of reminds me of brainstorming. And then, that's really what you're doing at the beginning of this whole process. You're brainstorming and getting ideas from multiple people but it's not people who are unrelated to the problem. And I think that's the key to this, is that it's the human factor and who's going to be affected by this, who is affected by this problem. So they need to be part of the solution.
Yep, I think he called that, or in our, maybe it was our previous reading, the empathy, aspect of.
Right, exactly. It is the empathy. You have to feel what they're feeling in order to be able to help find a good solution for them.
Yep.
I absolutely agree. So we know that design thinking is not a new idea. I think that we've given context to it now. And Tim indicated that he talked about a man called Brunel, who designed the railways in England. And it made me think of Robert Moses and his designs for the highways and the parks, and in particular Jones Beach on Long Island. So I wonder if he utilized design thinking when he was developing and making his ideas a reality. Do you think that he and Brunel thought about the design from a human-centered point, understanding what we need in the culture and context that affect the design? What do you think?
I would imagine you would have to. I mean, it's hard to know for sure because we don't have the information about their process that led up to the end product, but most likely they would have had to explore and exploit all the opposing ideas in order to come up with their, world-changing innovations, I would imagine. I would imagine it would have been design thinking, even though we may not have known it was called that back then, or wouldn't have those terms to assign to it.
Right. We didn't have the term design thinking. So I think it'll be interesting. There's that new movie out about the life of Robert Moses. So I think I need to go and see that and see if maybe that can help me give an answer to this, particular question.
Yeah, you'll have to come back and let us know.
Yeah, I will. I'll have to let you know. Okay, so Tim pointed out that design was too important to be left to designers. So who do you think should be included in the design process, and what important ideas do they bring to the process?
I think all the stakeholders we were mentioning, not just the person who's producing, but also the consumer, because they'll identify different problems and different roadblocks, but they'll also bring, different ideas based on their point of view. So for example, in the water example, it wasn't just the people who were supplying the water, but it was also the people who needed the water should probably be at that table, because they're all going to have different points of view and different needs, and that will help them come up with the best idea for the solution.
Yeah, I think that's really true there. I used to think that this might be, though, a contentious kind of process, because if you have people who have different points of view, and let's say you don't want to listen to the other people's because, you think your view is the best. It would seem that in order for this process to work effectively, that the people involved have to either be really open-minded and thoughtful listeners so that they can entertain the other ideas that people are bringing to the table without immediately dismissing them and saying, hey, mine's the best and yours stinks. But I think maybe, I wonder if they have some kind of facilitators.
Yes, that is super important. I think not a common quality that people have, thoughtful listening. Maybe we all need to embrace a little bit more. But I used to do a lot of this type of brainstorming in my role as a communications specialist. We would have public forums for education topics, and we would invite the community to come in, and they would sit at a round table with the administrators and some teachers and parents, and it was a bunch of different stakeholders to brainstorm ideas to solve problems that maybe were identified in the district. And we always would have a trained facilitator at each table, because it helps to keep the order. It kind of keeps the conversation flowing and makes sure that not one person is doing all the talking, and that maybe some of the other stakeholders aren't getting a chance to speak. And, if somebody gets hung up and married to their own idea, a facilitator can kind of help, put that on a chart as a bullet point and then keep the conversation moving. And I think that might be a good thing to have if it was, a really controversial topic or a controversial bunch of people, maybe.
That's a really good point. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the new approach that Tim spoke about, which is divergent thinking. So do you think introducing this makes a difference in the process of trying to come up with an idea for a solution?
I think it would make a big difference. I think I was explained that divergent thinking is more open-ended. It explores a bunch of different solutions because in that way you're, generating ideas, whereas the old way of thinking was just to take what already existed and work within those constraints before you would. So you would, try an idea and it would fail before you would move on to like the next idea. So I think when it's open-ended and you explore a bunch of solutions all together, not only is the process faster, but it's also more, I don't know what the word is, but it's going to be more productive.
Productive might be the word we're thinking. Yeah, I thought this term divergent thinking, which means, taking different paths here, is really a better way of thinking because we're not working within any kind of constraints. It's almost like if you're daydreaming and you're letting your mind just flow and go in different directions. So you can come up with some, new ideas and thoughts. It's almost like the terminology, thinking outside the box.
Yeah.
But I read a little more about this, and I really liked what someone else, I didn't write his name down, it's unfortunate, but he said that we could think of it not so much as thinking outside the box, but maybe scribbling on the edges and the corners and under the barcode that when we're bringing these new ideas, in. And I kind of like that. Definitely. I thought that was pretty good.
Yeah, I like that idea too. It's sort of, the age old, you learn from your failures and it's just allowing yourself to, completely explore every avenue and every thought process. And there is no bad ideas.
Yeah, I agree with you. So I want to move on to the other reading by Schön. And I really like the analogy that Schön dubbed the Conduit Metaphor. So what did you think of it?
Yeah, I loved it. It really helps to understand those problems that are inherent in communicating that we don't even realize. We all understand our words and what we're reading and what we're hearing based on our own experiences and perception, much like in the conduit metaphor, they only had their own little world to make sense of what was being relayed to them. So, and we all do that without even realizing it. We are coming from our own experiences in our own little world, and that shapes our understanding in the way we think everybody's talking the same language, but really we're not.
Yeah, and that's a really good point because it was really interesting to see that one person lived in kind of a rock world and they're using rocks to build all their fences, and the other person lives in a wood world, and maybe the other person lived in, I forgot, was it like kind of like a desert world?
Yeah, I think so.
But it was the idea that their experiences were so vastly different, yet they could take an idea and retool it with what they had around them. And I found that really kind of fascinating.
It is. And you're going to take what's useful for what you need to make it fit in your world, in much the same way somebody else is going to take what they need to fit in their world.
So the idea of giving reason, I thought was really appropriate in describing what makes a conversation work well. So sometimes when speaking to students, I find there's a disconnect between the answer given by a student to a question and the answer I might be seeking. I, too, have asked myself, how can I rephrase the question so that I know the student understands the lesson I was trying to convey, like the teacher did with her student? So what did you think of this idea of giving reason?
Yeah, I loved the example they used, and I think we so often underestimate the difficulty of communicating in general. His example that you're referring to where he was asking the student, well, where does the sun go? When the clouds are obscuring it from view. I think as an educator, I'm not a teacher yet, but I'm in the classroom. And I think it's sometimes frustrating because we have an answer in our head that we're waiting to hear. And they're not necessarily giving us that answer that we're expecting to hear. So, but we're forgetting, I think, that maybe they have a completely different thought in their head, sort of like our conduit metaphor. And that's not,
right.
And that they're expecting a certain question maybe that isn't jiving with what we're asking. So I think for me, the bottom line was, that students and teachers maybe aren't talking enough or giving reason enough. And I think that that's sort of been maybe, kind of not encouraged in the classroom. a lot up until this point, where you don't really have time necessarily to have those conversations a lot. You just want to get them to say the answer that you want to hear, and we're not like appreciating the exploration around the conversation maybe.
Yeah, I agree, because it's easy then to just, this is what I want, let's move on.
Yeah.
Instead of trying to generate more conversation and trying to understand what the student might be thinking.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's a real kind of dance that you have to have between a teacher and a student. And maybe we need to be more open. We need to be more open to that.
Yeah.
So it is interesting how communication is so important, which leads me to my next question of the example of the silent game. Like, I thought this was really enlightening, where the first child has to come up with a rule and apply it to a physical object. And then the second child has to, without any talking, has to mimic whatever that rule is, or try and figure out what the rule is, and then mimic that rule. And then there's a third child looking on, and they have to think about what the rule is. So I want to know, what did you think about what happened at the end when they started having discussions about this?
Right. I
all came up with different ideas.
Yeah, I thought it was a really, really interesting whole experiment. It sort of made me think of the telephone chain game where you whisper something in someone's ear, and by the time it gets to the end, it's completely different. But what a difficult thing to do. I was looking at the pictures and trying to see if I could come up with what their rules were, and it was really interesting, and it makes you really realize how important communication is. And it keeps coming back to these conversations and this communication where, so in the example with the conduit, they use just words. And that didn't really give the appropriate message either. But when you're just showing people without the words, it's still not really coming across clearly. So, I think the conversation back and forth between the two, show me, tell me, all of those things, are the only way to come up with better ideas and better solutions. It just exemplified how we misunderstand each other so easily.
I have another question for you, and that's the term reciprocal reflection.
Yeah.
So this term was new to me. Have you ever heard this before? And when does one begin to engage in reciprocal reflection?
Yeah, I had never heard that term at all. I think this is a little far-fetched off the topic, but it made me kind of think of when couples argue and they go to see a therapist who then teaches them how to communicate. So by teaching them to reflect and explain, for example, I said this, but I meant this. And the other person has to say, well, what I heard was, and those type of communication skills that, we're not taught a lot of the times. And it's a big part of the design thinking, I think.
Yeah, I agree. I think that we don't listen enough, and we don't internalize and take feedback from what somebody else says and view it, we'll say, without emotion. And I think a lot of times we view things with emotion, and that colors how we see an answer. Mm-hmm. Or we're applying our own experiences and perception to it, and therefore maybe taking it out of context. So I think this was really kind of eye-opening when we saw this. So what do you think educators can learn from this silent game?
I think, just bringing awareness to the fact that we all have multiple vision, that everybody has, a valid vision that might be different from our own. I think just learning the art of observation and reflection, never making assumptions, but also just to embrace the excitement of discovery. So I think an educator and a student can learn just as much from each other in this excitement of discovery, instead of just wanting them to give that one correct quote unquote answer, but listening to them too, and having a back and forth, and this excitement about discovering what each person is thinking is going to make them remember the lessons and really truly internalize them. I think it's going to be probably a big leap for some educators and students to get comfortable having these conversations and the design thinking in the beginning of it. And it might take some getting used to. But in the end, I think they're going to end up with a more authentic educational experience on both sides.
I definitely agree with that. I think getting out of their comfort zones is going to take work. And it's definitely going to be a leap of faith, I think, on the teacher's end, not so much on the student's end. But I think the rewards will be well worth the effort if they try and put this into, production, we'll say.
Absolutely.
So I really enjoyed talking with you today, Elizabeth, and thanks for joining me on the podcast.
I enjoyed it as well. Thank you.